This section here, I want to talk about the action potential of a contractile cardiomyocyte. There are many channels involved. Various movements of ions are going to cause the membrane potential to move around on the cardiomyocyte. My purpose here then is to give you kind of a summary in a visual way of what's happening to these various channels in movement of ions. Much of what I'm going to tell you working off this graph here I have written out for you on the following page. We did something similar when we looked at the various ion flows and channels, looking at, say, the SA node, which could also be is very similar to the the AV node, etc., except there we had no resting membrane potential. Well, in the cardiomyocytes, you have a resting membrane potential. One of the other differences is that in the undulating membrane potential of the pacemaker type of cells, it is the calcium that is the main driver in the initial depolarization. When it comes to the cardiomyocytes that are contractile in nature, it is the voltage-sensitive sodium channels that are the initial depolarization factor. And then the calcium comes in after that. So there's a difference between those as well. So what I've drawn are some red lines here to kind of help you visualize what's happening on these various channels as we go through the various phases of the action potential. So as we had in the pacemaker cells in terms of phases, so we have phases here as well. So we have phase 0, and phase 0 is going to be our depolarization phase. I'm just going to say dipole. Then phase 1 is going to be our early repolarization. Say repole. Then phase 2 is going to be our plateau phase. Whoops, backwards there. And then phase 3 will be our final repolarization. And then phase 4 is going to be our resting membrane potential. So now let's see what happens. Why is the action potential shaped this way? Well, we have our channels below here, and we have the little zeros here. So some of the shading is above the 0, some of the shading is below the 0. So when the shading is below the 0, so we'll go shading or shade below the 0, what that means is that inside the cell is becoming more positive. And if the shading is above the 0 line, that means the inside of the cell is becoming more negative. So that kind of helps you interpret. So the initial thing we're looking at is going to be our voltage-sensitive sodium channels. And again, remind you, there are many, many types of voltage-sensitive sodium channels, different isoforms, even within a cardiomyocyte. So the voltage-sensitive sodium channel opens, which allows then sodium to move into the cell, carrying its positive. And so that means as it goes inside the cell here, the inside the cell is becoming more positive. Therefore, it's driving the membrane potential towards the positive direction. You'll recall that the sodium nurse value is 50, 60-ish. It makes it up to 25, unlike a depolarization of a neuron, which makes it pretty much close to the nurse value for sodium. It doesn't go that high for the myocardial site here. So, but it does make it near the plus 20. So it goes up, and again, you see this here, voltage-sensitive sodium channel. Well, there are other things going on pretty much at the same time. It depolarizes, and in addition to that, we have our L-type calcium channel. It is beginning to open up, and it is allowing calcium to flow in. So another thing that is, again, driving it northward. But this time what's happening is that the L-type calcium channels only open. Now they're opening in response to the depolarization of the voltage-sensitive sodium channel. So there's a little bit of a delay. But I'm still starting to get some calcium to flow in here. Now you'll note here is our T calciums. Now the T-type transient calcium channels, which this author puts in here, very minor, very, very minor. In fact, some texts won't even mention it, so they are there in little bit trace amounts, but again, it's not that physiologically significant. But you'll note this is phase 1, I'm having early repolarization, which means I'm having something drag the membrane potential towards the more negative. Well, what's going on with that? Well, one thing going on is that I have here some outward rectifying potassium channels. Which means then, in this case, potassium is leaving. It's flowing out. So again, note that the shade is above the line, meaning this force here is wanting to make inside the cell to be more negative. So what I have here then between the outward rectifying potassium channel and then I'm having the L-type calcium channels opening up, I'm having potassium flow out, I'm having calcium flow in, but note what's happening to the membrane potential. It is going towards the negative direction, which means then I'm having more potassium flowing out than I am charge coming in. So who's winning the battle there? I'm having a net movement of positive outward in this initial phase. Now, there are a couple of other players here that are involved. And so the next channel here is actually a chloride channel. And when the chloride channel opens up, chloride is moving in. Well, that's a negative charge moving in, which means then I'm having a net positive charge on the outside. So therefore, I'm above, because it's making, again, the membrane to be more negative. So that's another factor that is driving this to be in the more negative direction, again, fighting back the calcium that's moving in terms of what's happening to the action potential during this phase 1. Another player that's involved is the sodium-calcium exchanger. And we've seen this before. This is my NCX. And so this is a simple exchanger, so it's not directly involving ATP or anything. It's just basically two opposite directions. So I'm going to have an exchanger that could go this way. So it could be pulling a calcium in, but it's going to be kicking out 3 sodiums. So when that happens, the net movement, if this is out and this is in, the net movement of charge is out. Of course, I could have it go the other way. In that case, I'm having my calcium leaving, and then I'm having 3 sodiums coming in. In that case, then, my net movement of charge is 1 plus 1 moving in. So this exchanger can go in either direction. So the direction that it goes is really a function of the forces acting on the calcium and the sodium. So in this case here, note I'm in the pretty positive area here. So if I'm in the positive area here, that means I've lost my driver for the sodium to be pushed in and kicking a calcium out. In fact, the greater force is calcium is coming in and pushing a sodium out. Again, why am I pushing a sodium out? Because I'm up here in the positive. I'm getting closer to the Nernst value for sodium. Therefore, I'm losing my driver of pushing sodium into the cell. So this will actually reverse. And so this is exactly what's going on over here. So that means I have yet another net movement of positive going out. So all of these things are coming into play to help with that early repolarization going on. As I move to the plateau phase, in the plateau phase, I'm kind of having, well, it's a plateau. So it's staying there, but I'm having a lot of things going on. So let's draw our eyes down and see I still have my L-type calcium channel, so I'm still having my calcium flow in, again a +2. But you'll also note now I'm having a significant number of other potassium channels that are opening up, allowing potassium to leave here and here. And these two channels there are going to be my delayed rectifying potassium channels. Also, what's coming into play here is I'm having some potassium that is leaving here, and this is my calcium-dependent potassium channel. And again, if you have to go back and review my lectures on the various types of potassium channels, please do so, because we talked about this before. Calcium-dependent potassium channel. So calcium is coming in and then allowing that channel to open up. So yet another availability of potassium to leave the cell. So as long as this is plateauing here, what that means is that the net change of charge during this phase 2 is 0. So for every positive charge coming into the cell, calcium, I'm having an equal positive charge leaving the cell, potassium. So it's a net 0 gain here. So it just hangs up there. But then also see what's happening, which is during the plateau phase, now my L-type calcium channels are closing. So as they close, now I am leaving, or I'm losing my ability for positive to flow in, and guess what is still happening after these channels begin to close, these L-types? I'm still having potassium leaving, potassium leaving, potassium leaving, potassium leaving. So therefore, now the net movement of charge out of the cell is potassium, and so now I'm bringing this thing down, phase 3, final repolarization. Another curious, interesting thing is we've had now a lot of calcium flow into the cell during the plateau phase. Note what's happening to my sodium-calcium exchanger. Now what's going on is actually reversing field. So now what I have is this scenario. Why? Because it's becoming more negative, which is giving a greater force of the sodium to be driven into the cell, which gives me more energy to start kicking calcium back out. This is pretty handy in the sense of if I have all of that calcium coming in, I really need help now getting that calcium back out for the next loop. So this is one of the mechanisms that's going to help remove the calcium out of the cell as the action potential finishes its phase. Now there's other ways. There's a calcium ATPase pump that also gets in on the act, but this is one of the ways you're literally pushing calcium back out, and you're using sodium to get that energy going. One of the things that's interesting is the last big push in terms of bringing us down to a phase 4 resting membrane potential is going to be my inward rectifying potassium channels. And it's busy over here, so I'm going to write it over here. Inward rectifying potassium channels. Now you'll recall from an earlier lecture when we say it's inward rectifying, all that means is that theoretically it's easier for potassium to flow into the cell than it is out of the cell. If you have an outward rectifying channel, that means it's easier for the potassium to flow out of the cell than in the cell. But calling it an inward rectifying potassium channel doesn't mean potassium is coming into the cell. What determines where potassium is going to go is going to be the electrical concentration forces, Nernst value. So even though we're calling this an inward rectifying potassium channel, potassium is leaving when that channel is open because those are the forces acting on the potassium. So you'll note during the plateau phase, these inward rectifying potassium channels are not quite as open. Maybe a little bit of potassium leaks out. But notice the big kick up here at the end. And the kick up there at the end is meaning a significant amount of potassium now is flowing out. And so the inward rectifying potassium channel is the main channel that really pulls this thing back down to a resting membrane potential, because by the time you get to the end, my delayed rectifying potassium channels have already closed down. And so it is that inward rectifying channel that will give it that last kick, and then it will settle down and go back to baseline yet again. And one other thing, just to make sure I don't leave anything out, remember we had a lot of sodium coming in, we got potassium leaving. I've got to reverse that, so now I'm having my ever-present sodium potassium ATPase pump. So it's going to be kicking out 3 sodiums and going to be pulling in 2 potassiums, okay, and this is out and this is in. Again, trying to realign the ion distribution. So one other thing I haven't mentioned, because it's not really that important, but this is right here. The IH is really IF, so these are my funny channels. They're not major players. You'll note nothing is happening as far as the funny channels are concerned. Why? Because we are above 0. Remember, that's one of the things that makes a funny channel called funny, is that they don't allow ions to flow through in the positive range. So you do have some funny channel activities with these cardiomyocytes, even the contractile variety, but during the action potential itself, they shut completely down and no sodium is leaking in. So what we see here is just a lovely arrangement of channels that are orchestrating this depolarizing event. Now, a couple other things before we close, and that is, I just need to mention this. What you're seeing here is just kind of a cartoon of a generic depolarization of a cardiomyocyte. If you looked up the depolarization profile of a cardiomyocyte in the atrium, it looks a little different in the sense that it's going to go up and it's going to come down, and then it comes down rather quickly. And so the plateau is not nearly as long. It's just, again, a characteristic of the various types of channels that the cardiomyocytes have in the atrium. The other thing that I want to point out as well is that the action potential profile of a cardiomyocyte in the ventricle will vary depending upon where in the ventricle you are. So it is not the case that the action potential profile in every cardiomyocyte in the ventricle is the same. They all vary. So this is just kind of a simplified cartoon of what a typical one would look like. Okay, last point is that you'll note that this action potential looks very different than an action potential of skeletal muscle or action potential in a neuron. We've stretched this thing out. The action potential for a neuron or for skeletal muscle will last, maybe 2 milliseconds. Okay, and this is 300 milliseconds here. So 2 milliseconds versus 300 milliseconds, a big difference. Well, I want you to think about this in terms of skeletal muscle. So if I want a more powerful contraction of a skeletal muscle, what's one of the ways you can do that? Well, one of the ways is temporal summation. So if I have a high frequency of action potentials, the higher the frequency, the more the calcium flows in, and the stronger the contraction of the skeletal muscle. And think about what skeletal muscles do. Well, skeletal muscles, at least most of them, are designed and function to move a joint. So you got skeletal muscle attached to bone, and then a skeletal muscle attached to another bone across a joint, and as it generates force, it's going to move that bone. So sometimes I need to move that joint in a more forceful fashion, so I'm just going to pop it with high-frequency action potentials. So I need a pretty quick turnaround to do that, and so there are some muscle fibers you can do, many hundreds of action potentials per second to get that effect. Well, think about what the heart does. The heart's not obviously attached to bone, so the heart is a soft tissue pump. And so the cycling of the heart, as we've already talked about, is that it contracts, but then it has to relax, be allowed to fill with blood so it can then contract again. Well, imagine what would happen if an action potential of a cardiomyocyte looked more like an action potential of a skeletal muscle, and then you have some neurosignals where now you're having very rapid sequences of action potentials, one every couple of milliseconds. Well, what that means then is that the cardiac muscle will just contract and stay contracted. Well, if it stays contracted, it can't relax and allow more blood to go through. So if I have a flurry of action potentials in rapid succession, if the action potentials were like skeletal muscle, the heart would just simply contract and you would have tetanus of the heart, and then you die. It can't function. So in some measure, this long plateau is a bit of a safety mechanism, keeping it from going to, quote, tetanus, in terms of just a contraction that won't let go. So that's one of the lovely things about the profile here of this action potential, is that there's a long period, and we'll talk about this in a later lecture, a long period here where it's in refractory. You remember, you have an absolute relative refractory period for neurons and skeletal muscle fibers, but it's a very short period of time. Well, in the action potential of a cardiomyocyte that's contractile, I'm going to have a relatively long refractory period, and that's a good thing in terms of keeping the muscle from having another action potential, which, of course, is going to be impacting the efficacy of the pumping action. Okay, so that's that. Now, one other thing here, I don't need for you to memorize these little guys right here. Okay, you certainly will want to know delayed rectifiers and L-type, T-type, and things like that, but don't get hung up on the little symbols there. I'm not going to put a I T sub O and then try to ask you what kind of channel that is. I'm not going to do that. Anyway, but I'm hoping this is a really nice visual that kind of shows a sequence of event during an action potential. And as I said earlier, I have tried to have this laid out in terms of verbiage, what I just told you in the past few minutes. All right, so we will close here and pick up next time.